It's my pleasure to welcome you to Diversity and Inclusion in the Military, an event the Dickey Center is co-sponsoring with the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, and which is part of Dartmouth's Veterans Day observance. In normal times, this observance would feature a retreat ceremony on the Dartmouth Green. Because of the pandemic, this ceremony, like so many other in-person events, cannot be held. In its stead, Brian Messier, the director of the Dartmouth Wind Ensemble, has graciously recorded himself playing Retreat and To the Colors, and we'd like to play that for you now. Many thanks to Brian Messier, the director of the Dartmouth Wind Ensemble, for playing that tribute in gratitude to all who have served our country in the armed forces. Let us continue to honor our veterans now with a discussion on who serves in the military and why that matters. Joining us are three distinguished members of the Dartmouth community. Jason Lyle is the inaugural James Wright Chair in Transnational Studies and an Associate Professor of Government. He researches the effect and effectiveness of political violence in civil and conventional wars and runs the Political Violence Field Lab at the Dickey Center for International Understanding. A current recipient of the prestigious Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, Professor Lyle deploys a variety of methods in his work, historical and cross-national comparisons, as well as field, survey, and other natural experiments. He has conducted research in Russia and Afghanistan, and between 2012 and 2015, he served as technical advisor for USAID's Measuring the Impact of Stabilization Initiatives, or MISTI, in Afghanistan, which looked at the effectiveness of aid in conflict settings. An important component of Professor Lyle's research concerns the relationship between inequality in societies and violence. He has applied this analysis to civil wars, as well as to how inequity affects military effectiveness. On this last topic, his recent book, Divided Armies, Inequality and Battlefield Performance in Modern War, was published this year by Princeton University Press. In it, he correlates the fate of an army's battlefield success to the level of social equality its soldiers enjoy. Drawing on more than 250 wars fought since 1800, he concludes that the higher the level of inequality among the ethnic groups within an army, the worse the battlefield performance. Inequality among soldiers in a military force leads to greater rates of desertion, side switching, casualties, and the use of coercion to force soldiers to fight. Professor Lyle will lead a conversation with two Dartmouth veterans. Brad Carney, class of 2020, is a philosophy major. He began his Army career in 2007 with the 82nd Airborne and deployed to Iraq as a forward observer, a role in which he was to spot and direct munitions from artillery, mortars, fixed-wing aircraft, and other close air support assets. In 2012, wanting to do something hard, Brad passed selection to the 75th Ranger Regiment, the U.S. Army's premier large-scale special operations force, and was assigned to the 3rd Ranger Battalion, a light infantry wing of the Rangers. It was the same desire to do something hard that impelled him to apply to Dartmouth, where he was admitted in the first class of Dartmouth's partnership with the Posse's Veterans Program. At Dartmouth, Brad has served as president of the Student Veterans Association, leading the chapter to join with the National Student Veterans of America. While he has contemplated getting a PhD in philosophy, Brad has now determined instead to attend law school and is currently waiting to learn where he will be next fall. In the meantime, he tutors underrepresented groups for the LSAT and will complete his Dartmouth coursework in March. Carla Rosas is also a member of the class of 2020. She served in the United States Air Force for 5 years as a member of USAF's security forces. Her military career includes tours as base security at the Royal Air Force Base in Mildenhall, England, and the Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, where she provided security for nuclear weapons and other classified government resources. She later deployed to Afghanistan and Djibouti before leaving active duty. After a brief time in the United States Air Force Reserves, Carla came to Dartmouth with the Posse Foundation's Veterans Scholarship, where she majored in government and Middle Eastern studies. In 2019, with the help of the Stamps Foundation, Carla co-founded the Servicewoman Collective, intended to initially gather and share stories of self-identifying servicewomen of all backgrounds to bring awareness to issues that affect this community. The collective's mission has since expanded to provide mentorship, resources, and news on policies that affect women in and out of the military. Carla was in the first cohort of female servicewomen Posse scholars and was the first undergraduate Latinx servicewoman to graduate from Dartmouth. Since her time in the military, she has remained close to the veteran community and volunteers at local VA hospitals. Carla is currently a senior associate at Quadrant Strategies, a business management consultancy in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for being here today. Those of you watching are encouraged to share your questions with our panelists via the Q&A function when the discussion between Professor Lyle and our veterans is concluded and they take their questions. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Lyle to lead the discussion with Brad and Carla on diversity and inclusion in the military. Over to you, Jay.
Well, thank you, Chris, for such a wonderful introduction and for the opportunity to speak tonight. I should just say at the outset that I am very much the warm-up act here. The real story, the real concert, if you will, that you want to see are the insights by Brad and Carla. So what I'd like to do is maybe just take 5 or maybe even 8 minutes just to situate the context of diversity and inclusion in the military and sort of sum up some of the lessons, which you actually already raised, Chris, from the book. And there's really 4 points that I would sort of emphasize. And the first is really that we don't know much about inclusion and diversity in the military, at least in political science and in history. Our academic fields have largely sort of shied away from questions of identity inside the military. We largely assume that soldiers sort of go through boot camp, they come out as soldiers, they don't bring their prior identities in with them. And so we've largely sort of missed this question of whether inclusion and diversity is even important for explaining things like battlefield performance. And for a long time, the US military, just take one example, has thought that diversity was a detriment to the battlefield. But we don't have a lot of data on this because we really haven't studied it. And I think you can see this actually in popular culture. I don't want to just pick on academics. Popular culture has also kind of sort of, taken the edges off questions of ethnicity and diversity in the military. There's a wonderful example of Sam Mendes's movie 1917, which came out last year, which caused a bit of an uproar in Britain because it had the temerity to show Indian soldiers in the British Army. And from a certain quadrant, you got all this criticism of saying, well, the movie's being politically correct. There were no Indians in the British Army serving in World War I, and when in fact 1 out of every 6 soldiers was in fact from the British Indian Army. And so we've largely missed this picture in our views of these armies as homogenous and universal and all soldiers kind of being functionally equivalent. And so part of the book, we went back and we just said, what is the diversity of armies since 1800? How diverse are they? And it turns out that they've been extremely diverse. The average army that has gone into battle has had at least 5 ethnic groups within it. So these are quite, mixed units, mixed formations as they go into battle. There are some extreme examples. The Soviet Red Army, which we typically assume as Russian, was in fact anything but. In fact, the Soviets fielded units in 1941 and 42 that had up to 28 different ethnic groups inside them. So these armies have been diverse since at least 1800 and probably well before that, but we just didn't know much about it. So part of what the book was trying to say is this probably matters. We should probably study it. Let's collect some data to look. The second big point is that, yes, this actually matters. This isn't a story of necessarily political correctness. It's really a story of diversity and inclusion being good for battlefield performance. And it turns out historically that the more inclusive your army is and the more diverse it is, the more lethal it is on the battlefield. And if you can imagine taking all these armies and just arraying them on a spectrum of very inclusive to incredibly exclusive, which would mean that all of the ethnic groups inside them are being, violently subjugated by their government. As you get up towards that more, the end of the spectrum, bad things start happening to your army, and they happen in droves. And Chris alluded to some of them in the introduction. Your casualty rate goes up as you get more unequal and more divided in your army. Your army tends to have much higher rates of desertion as soldiers flee for the exits rather than flee towards or move towards the battlefield. We actually do see defection. We see side switching where pieces of your army break away and join the other side to fight against your own army. And then most horrifically, throughout history, we've seen many examples of very divided armies essentially holding themselves together through violence. And again, just to return to the Soviet example, the Soviet Union during the course of World War II shot an estimated 160,000 of its own soldiers. It would place units behind ethnically disloyal units. And if those soldiers retreated, they had orders to shoot them. 160,000 soldiers is more than the United States lost in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And those are self-inflicted casualties. So here, yes, diversity and inclusion absolutely matter for how your army is going to perform on the battlefield. Now, the third point is, why does inequality have these effects? And you can think of inequality as being like a poison inside your army. It rots it from within. One of the things that inequality does is it throws away the advantages of having diversity. Now, we know from lots of studies in business and studies in social psychology, more diverse teams make better decisions, particularly in challenging environments like combat. And so if you're throwing away or you're not listening to particular voices in your army, your problem solving isn't as good as it needs to be. Your tactics become more rigid. You tend to take more losses because you can't maneuver your forces or can't think of more efficient solutions. So you throw away the diversity advantage. Then obviously, if you look inside, you have some ethnic groups that are privileged and some that are not. There's going to be very little trust, let alone love, between these units. And we often talk of bands of brothers forming in combat. Well, if you have a high level of mistrust between the ethnic groups within your army, you're not going to get this band of brother feeling, right? You're not going to have this desire to fight for your buddies if part of your buddies are the ones who have been repressing you or your group. So it shatters these bonds of trust. And then the third thing that it does is obviously it creates grievances among these marginalized groups. They don't want to fight for the state. They want to flee from it. They want to run. They want to escape. So you have to motivate them in other ways than loyalty. And often that falls down to being coercion on the battlefield. And you see the army essentially begin to turn inward. If it can't solve this question of diversity and inclusion, it will try to do so through violence against its own soldiers. And so the fourth point, just to sort of end on this note, is that inclusion is hard won and it is not guaranteed. So if you look historically, there have been armies that have backslid from inclusion towards greater exclusion, partly as a reflection of what is happening in their own society. So armies in many ways are reflections of their broader society. If the broader society moves away from inclusion, so too typically does the military itself. And you can see this most clearly, or at least closer to home, in the case of the African Americans who fought in World War I and World War II, who were promised through service that they would have full citizenship when they returned, and they would fight hard on the battlefields to demonstrate their worth to a state that had not treated them as equal citizens. And yet when they returned, both World War I and World War II, right, these soldiers were at best economically discriminated against, and at worst suffered violence when they returned to the home. And so these hard-won gains are not permanent. And there has to be, these armies have to stay vigilant, and the society stay vigilant, that they are maintaining and safeguarding this inclusion within the army. So the bottom line here for me is that diversity and inclusion are worth not only protecting, but extending to other units. So the book looks at ethnic and racial inequalities, but those aren't the only ones that exist. Gender exists. Sexual preferences and orientation, right? Sexual identity matters now as we have debates about whether transgender can serve in the US military or not. The argument in the book would suggest that you should extend membership, full membership in the military to all of these groups because you will reap the benefits of doing so, not just for moral reasons, but for practical war-fighting reasons. And just the last thought here I would leave you with is that if this is right, if this story that I'm telling is right, and this 400-page book is right, then racism is actually a national security threat, and we should treat it as such, not just for moral reasons, but actually because it will undermine the military effectiveness of your army, of your military, as it deploys into the challenges of the future. So I'll leave it there. I'll invite Brad and Carla to come in, and maybe we can have a bit of a conversation now, not just about diversity and inclusion, but I'd love to hear more about their own experiences serving and then out of service, being here at Dartmouth and seeing the contrast between how I say an academic environment deals with diversity and the military. But Brad, why don't I start with you and just, if you could give us, the audience, just a little bit of sense of what led you to join up and a little bit of a sense of what your experiences were serving.
Sure. Thanks, Professor Lyle. So I initially joined because of life circumstances. So I had gone to college and let's just call it a failure. I basically failed. And so I needed a different way to kind of navigate life. And, through long story short, I ended up in the military. I initially wanted to go into the Air Force and be a tactical air control party member, but this was 2006 and they were taking a very long time. Lots of people wanted to join the Air Force for kind of obvious reasons. A lot of people in the Army and Marines were dying because of IEDs. And so the Army was like, well, we can take you in like 2 weeks, and so after I got in contact with the Army recruiter, they were like, yeah, we can take you right now. So just come here. And so I went to the Army, did the closest job to what I wanted to do in the Air Force. And, in the Army, it was probably the most interesting experience I've ever had. It's an experiment and conditioning people to get along in an extreme environment. And I think we see when you put a lot of people together and have these external stressors on them, that people get along and they have a lot more in common than they think they do when there's kind of an outside threat coming at them. And so I am so very grateful for my time in the military because of that reason. And it's almost like the opposite of what I had at Dartmouth in terms of the way that I see diversity. Diversity in the military means it meant to me a little bit something different than maybe it means outside the military, such as at a place like Dartmouth.
Can I just jump in on that? What do you mean that the military means something different by diversity?
So I think that the tendency is, at least not in the civilian world, the tendency is to almost always go to how does a person look or how do they identify. That's not exclusive to that, which is to say like, oh, well, there are people who consider like intellectual diversity and other things like that, but it's just usually, I feel like it goes first to what do you look like or what kind of characteristic do you have to differentiate yourself from the mass group of people. Whereas in the military, it might have been a little bit less of that. I don't know how much, but just a tiny bit less and more, what do you bring to the table that is different? So like at a selection, through a selection course, they want to see people who bring skills to the table that the unit can use to make the unit better. And that's what matters, right? Is lethality.
Carla, can we bring you into the conversation and maybe just give us the sense of what led you to join and a bit of your experiences?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lau. So I joined the military January 4th, 2011. It was right at the height of the recession. And so what led me to join the military initially was my parents, with the housing crisis, they had to file for bankruptcy, and basically with all of that went my college money. So I had to get creative and find a way to pursue my education. And I didn't grow up, I did not grow up in the nice part of Chicago. So that was also something that I had in mind, was that I didn't want to stay there. And so I saw the military as an opportunity to move ahead and help my family. So I enlisted, first one in my family to ever join the military. It was, my mom and dad freaked out, but eventually they knew that I was gonna do what I had to do. And so I joined, and I was sent, after boot camp, was sent to England. I was stationed in England. And it was a lot of firsts for me. Not only being the first one in my family or in my ecosystem to join the military, but also it was really the first time I had ever left the country by myself. And it was also my first job too. I mean, I had little, jobs here and there throughout high school, but it was definitely an eye-opening experience when I got to England. And then as I started getting more work experience and getting exposed to different environments through my deployments and other assignments, I honestly came away with my military experience overall in a positive way. But, there were some issues, and, as a woman in the military in a predominantly male dominated career field in security forces, it did come with its challenge. And then you add, like me being a Latinx person on top of that, that also came with its own challenges. And I'm sure we're probably going to get to that later, but I'm also happy to expand on that. As far as diversity in the military, there definitely there's a lot of work to be done on that end. Whether it is, protecting trans people, or, including them again in the military, protecting women who are victims of sexual assault, and also men, protecting Black and brown people in the military, and giving them the space to report biased incidents. I think that is something that the military currently lacks. And I guess tying that into diversity at Dartmouth, I'm very grateful for everything that Dartmouth has done for me and all of the people that I've met. And I think that the institution is heading in the right direction as far as diversity and inclusion, but there is still work to do. And I think one of the main examples I can think of is, I'm the first Latinx woman veteran from the undergrad institution to graduate. And I think that a problem in terms of recruiting veterans into the Ivy League or across universities in general is that we need to be recruiting more women and more Black women as well. So I think on that end, Dartmouth could has work to do on that end, so.
There was 3 dissertations worth of material right there. I now have 25 questions that I didn't write down that now I want to ask you. One of them was actually going to be, if you were going to have the ear of the Secretary of Defense, and I was going to say it was Esper, but that was now no longer Esper. What would be your recommendations? But I'm going to hold off on that just a sec, because I just want to, both of you are in this unique position to see what diversity means in an academic setting and diversity in the military. And it seems like they mean different things. But from your point of view, how does the military, do you think the military actually values diversity? Right? Do you think it actually is seeking that, or is it more lip service from the outside world, and they're hearing and they're saying, yes, we're going to tick the diversity box, but there isn't an actual genuine commitment to diversity? And that's something that, as an outsider, it's hard for me to assess. But Brad, Carla, what do you think? Do you think there's a genuine commitment to ethnic or other kinds of diversity?
Carla.
Yeah, Carla, do you want to jump?
Sure. So I think I thought a lot about this before coming to this panel. And I think that the military first needs to define what diversity and inclusion means for the institution. I don't think that's very clear. And so because that's not clear, it's very hard to value something that you haven't defined yet. I do think there is obviously a lot of value bringing people from all over the country with different backgrounds, classes, you name it. There's a lot of value in having that in the military. I can tell you from firsthand, I actually worked with someone in the military that had never met a Black person in their life until they joined the military. So that in and of itself, you know, that expanded his worldview. So it was, you know, for me, that was very shocking because I grew up in Chicago and Chicago is extremely diverse. But because he was able to expose himself to other types of people, he grew closer to our flight, as we call it in the Air Force. So I do think there is value of having people from all types of backgrounds in the military. But like I said, we need to define what that is for the institution. And also we need to provide safe spaces for people to report biased incidents or sexual assault. So that's what I have to say on that.
Brad, what do you think?
Yeah, so I actually really do agree with Carla's point about the kind of addressing exactly what it is that we're trying to target. So for example, in the infantry, so I only served in infantry battalions. And so I've only ever worked in male spaces. I just haven't worked with women besides attachments. And so, you know, and there's also just not a lot of there's no racial diversity, right? It's like mostly young male, most typically white. And then, so you'll have like the Alpha through Delta companies as these infantry battalions, and they're almost all white. And then you have, it's almost like a joke in the military, but it's very real, where you have the Echo company, and the Echo company is like the support company that supports the infantry battalions. And it's almost all minorities, like almost all. And so if it's like, oh, well, you know, our lethality could be increased by, you know, having the army, because the army is just trying to make their numbers, right? And so that's what matters to them. But I think what ought to matter to us is that the military reflects our society. And so to me, there's not an obvious reason why there shouldn't be more Black infantrymen, right? There's Black Rangers, there's Black Special Forces, yeah, there's all kinds of people in Special Forces and Ranger battalions and other special operations groups. And so the Army could, or the military could, make an effort, right, to recruit these different people into different jobs, because I don't see a reason why we couldn't have something like that. But in terms of just like broad strokes diversity, the military seems to be diverse, just it depends where you're looking.
I mean, it's been often characterized to me that the military, in particular the Army, values diversity, but doesn't know what to do about inclusion. So the second piece of that. And, you know, you look at the senior leadership, it's almost solely white males in the Army. It's changing a little bit in the Navy and the Air Force, but not much. And so it seems, as an outsider, it seems that the military has sort of drunk the Kool-Aid on diversity, however defined, and maybe doesn't have a good definition of that, but is really struggling with the inclusion piece. Still in 2020, you do have these segregated units, if not officially, but unofficially, in Echo companies and things like that. And so would you agree with that the diversity piece is coming, but the inclusion piece is sort of lagging far behind, Carla?
In all honesty, I think they're both lagging behind, just because you look at our senior leadership right now, and it's not diverse at all. I think just recently in the last 2 years, they've started to promote Black people and women. I think recently the first Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, the first woman, was recently promoted this year. And women have been in the military for decades. So, you know, my question is, what took them so long? And also you have a Chief Master Sergeant who is Black, and he was recently, he just got out, and the woman Chief Master Sergeant just replaced him. But there hadn't been a Black Chief Master Sergeant promoted since the 1970s, and he was the first one. So I don't think diversity, there's still a long way to go with diversity. And, you know, there's also another piece of this is Black and Hispanic people are being recruited, but they are being recruited on the enlisted side. And very often you'll see recruiters going to Black and brown neighborhoods and recruiting specifically in those poorer neighborhoods, versus you'll never see them really in front, like at a predominantly white school. So I think that is also another piece, and as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned. I think some people would call it predatory recruitment, because they're going to all of these poor neighborhoods, recruiting, and they're not promoting them. So they're just using them as, you know, they're not investing in their professional development as much as other as much as other groups. So.
And there's generally an issue too, is it's both partly the selection into the military, but also the retention rates are very different as well, right? So on the sort of ethnic minority side, has much higher losses in terms of leaving the military earlier in their service than do sort of traditionally white recruits. And so it's not only an issue of how you sort of come in, but whether you're actually still staying in the military. And it seems in both your cases, you both decided to opt out and to leave. Maybe it would be helpful for some of our listeners just to know why, without getting into necessarily personal details, but you're both very accomplished, did terrific at Dartmouth, great choice on that, but you could have stayed in, and clearly you had a choice at some point and decided to leave. And so was it the atmosphere inside the military? Was it something else? Maybe Brad?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it wasn't actually an easy choice, but it ended up being an easy choice. I was in the recruitment process for Dartmouth through Posse, and then I was also had the choice between, I was going to keep going and try out for Special Forces later on. And so, I always figured I could at least get my college degree and then come back and go back into the military if that's what I wanted to do. But, I only have this college experience once or twice. There's a certain range you can have it at. And so I felt it would be more productive to go to school first and then go back if I wanted to. And so the military, I think, and maybe Carla's going to kind of echo this, but the military, it's a great job, but it gets old, and the potential, if you feel like you have a lot of potential in life, the military can feel like it's a limiting factor, depending on what you want to do and maybe potentially how much money you want to make.
Carla, would you agree?
So I came into as I mentioned in the beginning, I came into the military knowing I wanted to pursue my education. I tried to do that within the military while I was active duty, and it was impossible because obviously your mission comes first and then everything else is second. So that was incredibly difficult to manage. So I decided pretty early on that I was only gonna enlist for the time that I was enlisted active duty. but also I think a determining factor was that the way the promotion system is in the military, especially if you're more lower ranking, they promote based on time and service, not necessarily on merit, or they don't look at you like holistically as a person if you're fit to lead other people, at least in my experience. So what ends up happening is that maybe someone that is not necessarily fit to lead other troops is promoted, and then sometimes that could become a toxic culture because they may be aggressive or sexist or not professional in the very least. And so what happens with that is that just trickles down to your airmen, and it gets incredibly difficult to report or confide in someone because there are always power dynamics involved. And so for me, that was also a determining factor because I would say probably like 10% of like some leaders that I interacted with were not fit to be leading other troops, and that was even 10%. You definitely feel you definitely feel that affect you personally and your career to some regard, even if they're just supervising you for the next 6 months, for example. Those 6 months in terms of military time are a really long time, and they are an entire bullet on your performance report. So yeah, it's definitely one of the reasons why I ended up leaving the military.
Do you think the toxic environment, though, is due to who you are as your identity, or do you think that notion of the toxic environment would be shared by everyone, and that it wasn't necessarily that you're Latinx? It would be that it's just these are the wrong leaders in the position. Like any organization maybe selects the wrong leaders. I'm just trying to figure out how much of that is just bad management and how much of that is the diversity piece that we're talking about.
I think everyone experiences this in the military at some point, some more than others. But I'll give you an example. I recently spoke to a friend who is still in the military, and she is pretty high ranking. And her flight chief, there was a new flight chief that was sent to be in her unit and was technically in charge of her, was her supervisor. And the first thing he said when he met the entire flight, the flight's about 30 to 40 people, was that he was going to cleanse the flight. No one knew what that meant. And so what happened in the next couple of weeks was all the Black people in that flight were transferred somewhere else. And, with her being a Black person, that was, she did not know what to do. Even as a higher ranking person, she tried to talk to the person above her flight chief. They really didn't do anything because there was no, they had indicated there was no proof. And so she felt very alone in all of that. And I would say that is definitely an example of how sometimes the wrong people get promoted into positions where they're leading a sizable amount of people.
Brad, you were kind of nodding your head when Carla was talking about the toxic environment. I mean, have you seen kind of examples like that as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the infantry is a young man's game, or it's a young person's game now, right? And so your team leader is going to be, someone that's probably a year or two older than you. It's probably their first job, and nowadays they probably haven't deployed. Back in the day, they maybe had a combat deployment, and so they knew what they were talking about. But now it's just like combat deployments have slowed down, so it's like they might not even know exactly what they're talking about, and you get this kind of power goes to people's heads, and so in the military, there's a lot of ways to affect somebody's life without it being official. You can take people's time, right? If your team leader tells you to do something, you just do it. It doesn't have to be official. It's just like, unless you have a very, very good reason not to do it, you're going to do it. And so your life can be made easy or it can be made hard. And so you're in this precarious position where you or a person has to toe this line between, it's like, do I listen to this person who is kind of toxic, just berates me, yells at me, etc., or do I just need to get over it? Because at times you do need to get over it, right? If they're yelling at you, but you, like, I don't know, threw your 249 and you dropped it and you dropped all the ammo, well, then you're probably going to get yelled at, and that's okay. But if it's something like, I don't know, you were studying and they didn't like how you were studying, like it'd be something like that. Like, I just don't like the way you look right now, Carney. And they'd be like, well, what does that mean, right? I can't change the way my face looks. And so that would be the type of toxicity that is common enough.
So we're starting to get a bunch of questions in from the audience, and I want to turn to those in just a sec, but I have a self-interested question, and I'm going to try and maybe get some daylight between the two of you, because you seem like you agree on a lot, and we got to try and separate that a bit. I'm just curious, a lot of our theories, a lot of our literature suggests that, you take raw recruits and you bring them into the military, and both of you mentioned, Carla, especially first time away from home, first job, you're malleable, right? And you get sort of stamped into being a soldier, right? Or an airman, or this is what your identity is going to be. And you get wrapped up in the flag of patriotism, and sort of who you were before changes, right? That's not important anymore. And you're now part of this family, so to speak, a very large, very armed family, but nonetheless part of it. And yet you still see in some of your conversations, so on one hand, you seem like you agree with that. It seems like there is this training, boot camp, it reinforces this new identity. But I hear when you speak, though, it seems like some of your old sense of self is still there, right? And it's still, and the military spends a lot of money trying to train up people so that they follow commands, follow orders, right? And I can't get the sense of, like, how much of your original you stays with you, and how much of this sort of, I don't want to use the term indoctrination, but how much of this socialization changes who you are, so that these questions of diversity sort of fall away because you're all part of one family now. So where would you draw the line? Is it that the military is very good at creating these new identities for you, or no, it doesn't seem to stick as well as we would think from the outside? Carla, do you want to?
Yeah. So when I left my house at 18, I knew that deep down, like, I wasn't going to be the same person and things were going to change. I would say the first couple of years in the military, I look back and I don't know who Carla was. And it wasn't until I got out of the military when I recognized my own power and my own individuality. Some of that did come out towards the end of my enlistment, but it wasn't really until like years later after I got out where I was like, this is Carla. If I see something that's wrong, I'm going to say something, or if something is being said to me that is, not nice, I'm going to say something about that as well. Versus while I was in the military, if someone said something sexist or racist to me, like, I would laugh, but out of discomfort. And now I don't feel like I'm in that space at all anymore. So I feel like my experience in the military, it taught me so much about myself, and it made me a stronger person. It made me more direct. In all honesty, it prepared me for life. It prepared me for Dartmouth. And I don't think, without my military experience, I don't think I would have been as successful at Dartmouth, because what we're taught in the military is discipline, and you accomplish the mission at hand. And when I thought all was lost during my Dartmouth career, I always referred back to those skills that I learned in the military. So I don't think I ever really lost myself. I think I think for a while there, I thought I was lost, but she came back eventually.
Mhm. Brad, what do you think?
I'll try to differentiate myself. So I have I'll say I have there's like two Brads, right? There's the philosophy major, like I like to debate and argue type of Brad. And then there's also like we need to go to work, right? In terms of like military stuff. And those are just two very different people. Because what I think my individual self comes out at Dartmouth, right, where my particular interests are at the forefront, along with societies. There's some mix of society's interest in what I think the good is, and then there's also my own personal interest. But in the military, that cannot be the case. And so, like, if I could summarize this point, it would be that if you had everyone post Dartmouth, and like, so the Army enlisted side was just a whole bunch of Dartmouth people after they graduated, it wouldn't work, right? Because it's like too individualistic. People are like, it has to be mission first or it does not work. And there has to be some level of ability to allow yourself to take a back seat at times, because it's extremely important, because it could save your life or someone else's. And so, yeah, kind of like what Carla was saying about, the racist stuff. In the infantry, it's very personal. Like I made some of the best friends there, and we can make jokes like that to each other because they're like my brothers, truly. And I don't have anyone else like that in my life. I just haven't. I have a sibling too, my sisters. I'm close to my sister, but it's just a different type. It's like the closest fraternity that you will ever have. And so just the way, if somebody did that in like my normal everyday life, it's like, whoa, like, what are you talking about? But in the military, it's like, it's just a little bit different, and it's very hard to explain. And it sounds like I'm crazy, and I understand that, but it just is different. Depending on where you are. I'm sure there's like places in the military where it's like, oh, we're not that close. Like, don't say that to me. But in the infantry, I like sleep in, like I slept in a sleeping bag with my friend. So it's like, you're very close with people.
So I'm going to get in trouble if I don't get to some of the questions in the Q&A. And I also want to ask you one big wrap-up question of what you would do if you could actually speak to the Secretary of Defense and you could just give one recommendation for changing some of the things you didn't like about your service. But there are literally 4 or 5 questions here that all are asking about something that you raised, Carla, about the predatory nature, almost predatory nature of recruitment into the military, and that it seems like it's preying upon ethnic minorities with poor economic life chances, and that this is one of the biggest areas of diversity that the military is not talking about because it needs this, right? There's sort of diversity once you're inside, and we can talk about that. But where the recruitment is happening, people are asking, is it really so predatory as you're making out? And so I wanted to raise a question to both of you. Did you feel that this was predatory? Both of you spoke in terms of opportunities being raised, but was there a predatory aspect to this?
I think for me, in my experience going through recruitment, it wasn't predatory because I walked in there. I made the choice of, I thought it out and, talked to my sister and really, wrote a pros and cons list that I still have of, if I were to join the military. So I walked in that recruitment office myself. But a lot of times, I went to one of the worst high schools in Chicago, and, you would have Army and Marine recruiters sitting in the cafeteria, trying to recruit students that, may not be in the position to fully, to fully process what they're about to do. And a lot of times, especially for parents that don't speak English, they have no idea what their child is signing up for. So in that sense, it is predatory when you don't have someone that really is that has experience in the military and can, kind of guide you in that sense. But you do, at my high school, they had recruiters there all the time. And I would see people, they would like bring basketballs, they'd bring little gifts for students. And, that doesn't really sit well when you're giving, you're incentivizing them to, sign up. So that was my experience. I think that the military, I wouldn't be where I am today without the military. So it was definitely an opportunity for me and my family. I've met the best people, but not many people are as lucky as me. And I think that, once you enter into the military, it's also about leadership opening up opportunities for you, not just opening up opportunities for their friends or people that they are mentoring. It's, looking at the person and like in terms of leadership abilities and what they've done in the past and their past assignments. And that's not happening sometimes. So what you'll have is people getting promoted and it was their friend that they served with in Afghanistan, for example. But also something that I wanted to mention more on the gender topic is also how women are ostracized for reporting sexual assault, and women who become pregnant in the military. In my experience, I saw a woman who was married get pregnant, and people were saying that it was an inconvenience to the mission at hand. And this woman was married and well in her right to get pregnant. So, imagine if it happens to a single woman. And so I think that's also something that needs to be addressed if I had the ear of the Secretary of Defense.
That's a great way of working that in, because we're like at 2 minutes left for a question. So Brad, can I know I wanted to talk about the potential predatory hiring practices, but I'd love to know if you had the ear of the SecDef, and what would be something you would recommend to make a more inclusive military? I mean, like, why aren't we seeing a more inclusive military? Where's that stumbling block, right? So what would you recommend?
So my recommendation is to fund a study to understand the perhaps like cultural reluctance of particular minority groups to join combat arms. And why? Because historically we have, and it's just not there now, but historically we've been part of lots of important battles and wars.
So, and you think that the stumbling block is on the side of the ethnic minorities not selecting in, or you think it's on the side of the Army purposely keeping out?
I think selecting in is the issue. I mean, yeah, they just say, why would I only have personal experience to go off of, but it's just like, well, why would I do that when I make the same amount of money and, I might get shot or something. So.
Right. It's going to be interesting too, just to watch it kind of going forward with the new administration and seeing now society. I mean, we didn't really talk a lot about the societal influences, but it'd be very interesting to see what's going to happen with Black Lives Matter, pushing from the outside to try and push for more meaningful reforms, potentially within the military. I actually serve on a board for the Special Forces University, and they're actually now, for the first time, having diversity and inclusion initiatives to see how the Special Forces can harness in their language, harness the power of diversity. And I don't think that conversation would have happened had there not been sort of external pressure coming in. So, I'm trying to end on a potentially hopeful note. Progress is very slow, and both of you have done a wonderful job outlining all of these key stumbling blocks, and there's a lot. But there is pressure mounting, I think, from society, and if militaries really do reflect the society, maybe there is hope that some of these barriers to greater inclusion are going to lift in the future. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Well, on that note, finishing on an optimistic note, let me just thank you, Carla and Brad, so much for your service, for your engagement here today, for your courage and sharing your experiences. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Professor Lyle, for hosting our event, asking those probing questions, and for moderating our conversation today. Before we leave, let me just remind our audience of two not to be missed events that are upcoming, the final events for both the Rockefeller Center and the Dickey Center for International Understanding. Tomorrow, on Thursday, November 12th, the Rockefeller Center airs a post-election analysis with CNN's Jake Tapper, member of the class of 1991. Hosted by Rocky director Jason Barabas, class of 96, and moderated by the Rockefeller Center's Professor Charles Whelan, class of 88, it's guaranteed to be a frank assessment of just what happened and what is next. Join us tomorrow at November 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then on Monday, November 16th, the Dickey Center for International Understanding brings back 3 career foreign policy professionals for a look at the future of U.S. foreign policy in the wake of the 2020 election. Join Ambassador Johnny Carson, retired CIA analyst Chris Savos, and Ann Wachowski, formerly of the National Security Council and the Department of Defense, for what we might expect for the United States in the world. That takes place Monday, November 16th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you then.